Welcome to today's event at this year's Swindon Festival of Literature, which, as a result of restrictions to prevent the spread of that virus, has become a virtual online festival of literature. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone, and we do hope that everything is well where you are. We're both pleased and grateful that human ingenuity, cutting-edge science, and digital technology make it possible for this show to go on, or at least to go on online. Now, among the many things a festival like ours hopes to achieve, one is to introduce new voices to the world of contemporary literature. And today we have just such a voice. Today, we are pleased to introduce a new collection from a brilliant new voice in poetry and prose. Her newly published collection, titled Blood and Water, Obara and mmiri, published by Waterloo Press under the auspices of their Lit Up Arts Council funded mentoring and publishing program, travels across continents and cultures. It is a book of self-discovery and bold departures, which examines the pull of the Western world. And it looks like this. It's got a lovely cover. Please join me in giving a Swindon Festival of Literature welcome to an author who has lived, studied, and worked in many near and far-flung places, all of which inform her new work. Welcome, Catherine Okoronkwo. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you so much for having me at this year's Swindon Festival of Literature.
Well, it's very nice that you could join us, even, Catherine, if it's only online. And it's a pity we can't see you alive somewhere in a lovely venue in Swindon, because Swindon in spring is lovely. Do you know Swindon?
Yes, I'm actually based in Swindon. I moved to Swindon about 13 months ago. I work as a vicar of two churches, All Saints and St. Barnabas in Gorse Hill and Ferndale. So I've known Swindon pretty much in lockdown. So it's grown on me, but I still feel that there is a lot about Swindon I still need to explore and find out about.
Oh, well, that's terrific. I mean, it's because you've only been here during the time of coronavirus that we in Swindon's writing and reading community haven't met you personally, but we look forward to that very much. Okay, we better get to the topic in hand, your new book, Blood and Water, which one reviewer praises highly, highly indeed, but adding that this is not a book to be read simply for entertainment, which sounds like a warning. Catherine, perhaps you would tell us more, and maybe you'd like to read from it, and also perhaps tell us how it came about. And also, I'm intrigued why it comprises both prose and poetry. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Matt. One of the things that I tackle in this collection is social injustices, both on the African continent and in addition in the Western world. Having grown up as a third culture child, so I was born in Nigeria, but I left Nigeria when I was 3 months old, moved away to live in Israel, Jerusalem, and then studied in the West, in the America, and also in Britain. And one of the things that really consumed me as a young girl, growing up in all these cultures, was observing some of the difficulties that people endured. So for example, the role of girls in the Nigerian culture, how mental health was approached in some of these cultures, but particularly in Nigeria, and also just the power of the patriarchy. So the headship of men and the way women had to try and fit in or find their way through some of those difficult authoritarian relationships. So a lot of what's in this book speaks to that. Another thing that I'm very interested in is the whole topic of HIV and AIDS, which has blighted the African continent on many levels, and also seen how the injustices can be traced when we see how people fare far better in Europe, particularly in Britain, where HIV and AIDS is very much a manageable illness. So this is a book about a variety of injustices that I observed. And I think from a very young age, because my father worked for the UN and my mother was a housewife, there was a lot that I was questioning from such a young age. And so a lot of this book reflects that search for identity, trying to make sense and make meaning of what it means to be an African Black girl in the world as I was growing up. A lot of my work are portraiteurs, so they give a bit of portraits about people that I encountered, family members, and I remember some people ask me how I got into writing, and I really think that my grandfather, my papuku, is the one who gave me a love for storytelling. Every other summer, we would travel to Nigeria because we're based in Israel at the time, and we'll go to Nigeria to spend our summers with our grandparents. And I really remember sitting at the foot of my grandfather as he just told these incredible stories. A lot of it fable, a lot of myth, but they're just an incredible storyteller. And I think that's where my interest in words and in finding myself in different landscapes emerged. So one of these poems is about Papuku. So I'll just read this. Papuku, grandfather. On a carved stool, he gulps Ovaltine, fans firewood in the yard. In a cast iron pot, plucked chicken, feathers on the ground. He rises in sandaled feet, mutters incantations to a host of silent gods. From our box, scoops tobacco in nostrils, chews cola nut, eyes closed, hand raised, begs with a guttural voice, may Obara accept our gift. Now, one of my fascinations with my papuku was that he was a native doctor, and I was just enthralled by this spiritual element to my papuku. So I tended to watch him very carefully when people would come to the compound seeking his witchcraft medicine, so to speak, to cure some sort of ailment within the household. So Papuku is and was a dear person in my life. One thing I do speak about a lot in my writing is place, because I think place shapes and nurtures our identity in many ways. And I have always struggled to find my identity. Who am I? Am I an African? Am I a Westerner? Or am I a hybrid of both or none of either place, really? And a lot of my writing evokes images of not only place, but some of the fragrance and the smells and the textures of those places. Because I think that in a way that our memories, in a way, shape who we are. And so this poem I'm about to read is titled Identity. Identity. Memories from my birthland, a place of soot and grime. The Umoba yard where Mamuku's kitchen funneled tales among wafts of goat pepper soup. Plantain and yam, oxtail and tripe stew, prepared in mother's kitchen for special occasions. On other days, plain pancakes sweetened with lemon and sugar, peanut butter on thick cut bread from the local village store, a bowl of porridge with carnation milk swirled in. Mamuku talked and talked, dropped off, head bopping, pulled down lips dribbling, snores deepened, lengthened till her morning Milo. I am all these things, plantains, pancakes, and pulled down lips. A lot of my writing depicts some difficult scenes that I observed as a child. And one scene that really was rather quite traumatic for me was the death of a goat. In Africa, goats are a delicacy, at least in Nigeria. And the goat was slaughtered in the middle of our yard. And I remember being absolutely horrified that this could happen. And over the years, anytime my parents took us to people's houses and they would offer us goat meat, my mom would have to make her sincere apologies and say, actually, our children don't eat goat meat. And it's for this very reason. So this poem is titled The Feast. The Feast. Tongue lolls, blood gushes, rushes unto baked Umoba soil. My witch doctor grandfather carves up the carcass, spends hours cleaning, praying, and splaying. The stink tickles the air. 7-year-old eyes transfixed by the smirk on the dead creature's jaws. The goat with a slit throat. Has he breathed his last bleats, or more mmiri thrown him a lifeline? Another very traumatic image was that of a boy who was being necklaced in a market square. So necklacing, for folk who aren't familiar with this practice, is when a tire filled with petrol or kerosene is placed round a person's neck and set alight, and they're burnt alive. Now, it's not quite sure what happened in terms of why this boy, he seemed rather young, in my opinion, at that time, why it was felt that he should be necklaced, but apparently he had stolen something in the market. And that image really stays with me to this day. This poem is titled Dead and Dying. Dead and dying. A charred fetus abandoned on Aba-Owerri Road. A youth under a torn umbrella mends shoes. Ashes and sparks scatter in the Harmattan wind. A woman balances a basket of coconuts to sell. Sweat blisters on bleached skin. A wild silhouette falls, hand flails through a tire in orangey red flame. Stomachs of young and old gather around a wide-eyed cow. The air dry and clogged with burning rubber masks the stench of gutters, rotten waste, the dead and dying. One thing that was so affecting about that image and that scene was the way in which people seem to see this as an ordinary, everyday occurrence, so that the cow was of more interest than the boy who was dying in that manner. And incidentally, as we were watching this scene, we were in the car with our driver, and he just literally peeled a banana and was just eating his banana as we watched this scene in horror. Another thing that is quite significant on the African landscape, from outside of Africa anyhow, which is Igbo, is that boys matter. It's only till recently where women are able to actually inherit land, even if you're a first daughter. And sometimes people wonder why my parents invested so much in our education and why I've got so many degrees. Well, that's the very reason, because my father understood that as a girl, you know, if anything happened to him, we would not inherit anything from all his wealth. And it's actually the male boys in the family that would. This is something that happened, as I observed again when I was a child, and it's called, the poem I've titled it, Only a Boy Counts. Only a boy counts. I don't have any children, drunk Uncle Oti declared. His teenage girls and I sat huddled on the living room floor. He wagged, swaggered, burped, dazed by the effect of palm wine, and repeated, God has cursed my first wife. I have no heir. Years later, he took a younger bride, 16, uneducated, silent, redeemed by her wide hips, able to conceive a plump baby boy. She took charge of the main house, shooed away my uncle's prettier first wife. These events highlighted my mother's many insecurities. Fears birthed out of miscarriages, producing 2 female seeds. After 2 decades of prayer-fueled fights, she delivered that desired boy child. Another poem that I've written is around mental health. One of my uncles, we come from a family where mental health is a significant issue. But, you know, in Africa, it's very difficult for people to get the help that they need. My uncle was tied to a pole. Every time we used to go home, we'd see him tied to this pole because he had significant mental health issues. And it was frightening as a child to see him tied in that manner. But it was very much part of the way things were done in those days and still are in many ways. So this poem is titled Bananas and Groundnuts. Bananas and groundnuts. I'll race you to Port Harcourt. We'll feast on bananas and groundnuts. I whispered this to my boyish uncle, his wrist chained to a metal pole, wedged in the middle of the compound. Beneath Umumbede skies he writhed, squat or sat, legs outstretched. chained up all day and all night. That's where he cussed, ate, and pissed. His malodor, rotten cassava, clings to the dust. A fire burns in the distance. And from this section of my poems, which is the first half of the collection, pretty much based in Nigeria, I will read this final poem. Now, my parents are Christians. We were raised as Anglicans. However, as I mentioned, my grandfather was a native doctor, so he wasn't a Christian. And there's a lot of native spirituality that comes through my poetry because it's almost a cultural thing. And it's a part of our heritage in terms of the stories that were told, the experiences that we have. And so my mother had a lot of experiences growing up in terms of meeting beings in the spirit world. Now, whether you believe it or not, it's something that is a real big part of our heritage, at least our family's heritage. So this poem is titled In Between People. In Between People. A story my mother told me. One late night, amid busking katydids, she journeyed from Umuoba to Aba town. The emergency, a dying, distant relative. Traveling over a low bridge, lying over shallow water, she saw them, young and old, splashing, washing, bathing, laughing. The in-between people, their inky silhouettes. Don't make a sound, her mother said. The living should never intrude on the dead. Thank you. So that's the first part of the poetry collection. I will read some from the second part, but Matt, I don't know whether you had any questions around that.
You can see I'd put myself onto mute and I was just carried away. You have an incantatory way of reading, which is quite different to a standard kind of reading that one hears, but nevertheless is just as I said in my introduction, I'm so pleased, a new voice, which is so important. And what I also like very much, Catherine, is your introductions to the poems, because your publishers kindly sent me a collection and I read them, and I read them twice, and I wanted to ask questions because there were lines that hung in the air for me. They hung there in the air, begging to be pulled down towards me and embraced and understood, but I didn't quite get them. They hung there. And your stories have brought them down to earth. And sometimes that is a disservice to the poem. But at the risk of talking to you as if I'm a reviewer rather than an interviewer, I'd like to say your stories are a key part of your poems. And I almost can understand now why parts of this book are also prose. So thank you very much for reading those poems from the blood part of your book. But over to you for a little bit more, because I'm biting my tongue to resist myself saying, I want to read one of my favorites, but I'm just waiting to see if you pick them anyway. So a little bit more from you, Catherine.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So Blood and Water is a collection of poetry. The blood part is pretty much set in Africa, in Nigeria specifically, in Igbo land. And the water part is set in the West, in the UK. A lot of the water poems, again, are reflections of people, observations of life in terms of me as a person trying to make my way in the world, trying to figure out what relationships mean to me and how one does relationship in a way that honors oneself and in a way that honors one's identity, so to speak. In writing a lot of these poems, it was quite a process and a journey, as one can imagine. There's a lot of emotion that can get in the way of writing really good poetry, I think. And so the journey has to happen because the work needs to be done, I think, in oneself, so that you can actually break through to find the beauty and the gift that the poem wants to offer you in a way. So I'll read from the water section of my poems. Now, I had quite a difficult relationship with my parents growing up. I'm talking about particularly in my teenage years into young adulthood. And once again, I think it's because as a third culture kid, there was this incredible clash of cultures happening in our household. And also, as my parents were trying to raise African children in a very Western context, we battled our wills, our egos, battled to see who would win this war. Thankfully, my parents and I have a really good relationship now, but it hasn't been easy. But I do reflect a lot on some of the things, you know, young people might take for granted that they could have asked their mothers or their fathers, which I wasn't able to, simply because perhaps my parents weren't equipped because of their upbringing to have those conversations with us. So this is a poem titled Relationship, a Note to My Mother. Relationship, a note to my mother. Red leaks from vaginal labia, keeps me on toilet seat, frightened, unable to move. How will I say to my mother? What will I say to my mother? How will I explain all this bother? The bloody mess on tiled floor, the stain on my new school skirts. I sit and wait, not sure what to do. I use my pinky, form a U, feel sticky wet, more red escapes, finger released, whiff of rich iron and bovril. 11 and unsure if I might be dying. I try to stay calm with each deep breath, focus on smudged handprint by the light switch. But what will I tell my mother? And equally, my dad was a man who was very traditional, very authoritarian in many ways. He believed he was the head of the house and children should be obedient to him. And in as much as I battled with my mother. I had more of a relationship with my mother than I did with my father. And so there was a point in our lives when my mother, for whatever reason, had to travel to Nigeria for a while. And she left me with my father. And I have never been so anxious about anything in my life because my father and I didn't really have a relationship. What on earth were we going to talk about? How on earth were we going to live together for an entire month over the summer? So this is titled, The Way It Was With You, a note to my father. The way it was with you, a note to my father. Sour-faced and stern, left with you for a month while Mom was away. We had little to say from sunrise to sunset. You went to work and I stayed home, wrestled with algebra sums or read a book by C.S. Lewis till it was time to cook a meal for two. My soggy rice riled. Will you ever be a good wife like your mother? I didn't blame you. The rice was salty, not helped by the half-done mutton. You grunted and spat, left half a plate untouched, plus unchewed fat. After our evening meals, a heavier silence clung to the curtains. You, nose deep in a newspaper with your legs extended across the coffee table. I retreated to my bedroom, opened a window, listened to a distant thunderstorm, and watched rain fall. I think from a very young age, I learned how to enjoy my own company. Perhaps for that reason, I ended up learning to enjoy being on my own without conversation, and found haven, I suppose, in reading and books. And I think the last poem I'll read is Golden Shovel. Now, this is a made-up story. Some people wonder if every poem in this collection is autobiographical, and it isn't. There are some poems there that are simply written, made from my imagination. And this is a golden shovel after John Burnside's Like Father. Golden shovel after John Burnside's Like Father. Red lanterns dangle along washing line. I'm drunk on cheap vodka and wine, can hardly stand. I dance blind with Morris, bestie of 20 plus years. He allows me to lean on sweat-soaked chest. I sway. Sing, sing, sing. My eyes bloodshot, sting salty tears. Worst night of my life. Stumble, fall. Lifetime of mistakes swell my belly until I purge and purge and purge. I die that night, travel beyond mushrooms and dead baby girl on the road to redemption. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you very much. I'm carried away, and you know, I know the first edition of your book sold out very quickly. I hope they get another edition out. We'll give all the details on our website for people to get copies of this book.
Thank you.
And if there are any poetry festival organizers out there, if you want a reader for any of your events, I can recommend one who has read out of the 7 favorite poems I have in here. Catherine, you've read 3 of them, but we don't have time to read the other 4. But since you did say to me before we started, if you want to read one, Matt, you're welcome to. By way of giving you a rest, is that still all right, Catherine?
That'd be brilliant, absolutely.
Well, since you were working through the book and you were coming towards the end of Water, I'd like to take one of my favorite poems, which is towards the end of Water, which is Repentance, on page 48. Repentance. I ran out of time in my checklist of life, portfolio career, PhD, promotions, marriage, and mothering. I had many adventures to distant lands, Morocco, Malawi, and the Maldives. Took photographs of faux sadhu, vitiligo beggar, and children with dreams of eating pasta and pizza and polenta cakes. I pushed 12-hour days, microwaved all meals, pedaled at the gym, longing for Christ's abundant life. When I fell ill, the desire to carry a child grew and kicked inside me, but eggs were in decline. I heard the fading cry of children, lost before they became. There were 3. Years spent salsa dancing, drinking mango smoothies, smoking hookahs, sexing it up and sailing dinghies. I wanted it all, but I wanted it all, but
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Matt. It's really lovely to hear the poem. I think you're the first person to read a poem of mine in such a platform. So thank you.
You're very welcome. I think we better stop because I'm about to say that many of your poems speak to me in a very personal way, which is not the objective remark a festival organizer is meant to make about someone else's poems. But I think many people will find, you know, you spoke at the start about identity and about being from one continent and living on other continents. And I think what makes me feel drawn to these poems is that actually I'm one of many people, thousands of people, who have had similar experiences. And I think in today's world, more and more people are having these experiences where we are not rooted to one place for all of our lives. Opportunities are there for us to meet strangers, to move to other places, to be drawn to other cultures, which is a beautiful thing. You know, the shorthand way of saying it is the world is a global village. A nicer way of saying it is that the world belongs to all of us. And now we are struggling to find how to be in all parts of the world with ourselves. And that may take time, but I think poems like this and stories like yours will help. Do you agree, Catherine? I
totally do. I just hope that those who engage with the work in the collection of poems will resonate in different ways. And I think the beauty of poetry is that it opens up possibilities for people in terms of there's so many layers that you can read in a poem in terms of what it means. and particularly how you relate to that poem, perhaps, really. So I do hope many people will find something that is a gift in these poems. Yeah.
I'm sure they will, Catherine. Thank you very much. The details of your book will appear immediately after this presentation on our festival website, and it's already on our festival website, but it will appear immediately after this talk. Catherine Okoronkwo, the Swindon Festival of Literature, thanks you very much for being part of our festival this year. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.